Most of my career has been spent teaching social work, and I do love the academy and I love social work theory, and more recently I have worked using critical reflection with other professions as well. So I'm very interested in professional practice broadly and how we maintain our integrity in the current environment. So some of that will come out in the course of my speaking to you. So I think you'll get to know me a little bit better over the next few days and vice versa. If you want to ask me anything later about myself, you're more than welcome. So thank you.
Thank you.
I did want to thank you again for the invitation. This is my first visit to the Czech Republic, and so far I'm enjoying myself very much. And I said to Paul when I was asked to do the workshop on Saturday on critical reflection, it is such a great luxury for me to be able to speak about these issues because they are the part of my work that I enjoy most these days. What I'm going to talk to you about today is partly involves some of my experience in being involved with critical reflection with practitioners. Part of what I do, other than my day job, the day job is I'm actually a manager. I manage a social work school at Dalhousie University, and I call that my paying job. But my other job is that I do travel around quite a bit, and I deliver critical reflection training, mostly to social workers, but sometimes to other professionals as well. So what I'm going to talk to you about will also be some of my observations from doing that kind of training. Okay, so there'll be some theoretical bits, but there will also be some reflective bits that I will talk to you about as well. Okay, now, I did want to relate the topic to postmodernism. Can you see me okay if I come down here? These are some of the things that I observe from doing the critical reflection workshops. I hear a lot about practitioners' work, and these are some of the things that they tell me. They often find their current work very disempowering and discouraging. Now, I'm not going to tell you this in order to depress you, but of course some of it might. But I think it's important to acknowledge what the experience of practice is actually like for people. Some people say, this is not why we went into social work in the first place. Okay? And they feel like they have to constantly justify why they're doing what they're doing. Okay? Now, I must say this was probably worse in the UK because the UK is very bureaucratic and they constantly change their policies there. So every time, for instance, there is a child death, there is a review of the whole social work profession and a review of the way social work is practiced. So many social workers in the UK feel like they have to justify what they're doing all the time. They don't feel like they have much discretion. And sometimes they say they feel like a misfit in the team or within the broader organisation. Social workers sometimes feel like they're the only people who really care about their patients or their clients or their service users. So they often feel like they're the forefront, the place between the public and between the organisation. Okay? Unfortunately, so if they're in the health sector, for instance, the social workers often feel that they are the most devalued professional group and sometimes find it very difficult to find a way to talk about what they do in a way which values it for other professionals. And I particularly do find this in the health sector, that social workers are feeling like the health discourse dominates and social work ways of working don't fit, but they also cannot find a way to talk about their work that fits within the health discourse. Okay. Another part of the experience is that they actually feel very distanced from where the decisions are made. And this, I found this happening in Canada when I first arrived, because a Conservative government had just been voted in, and there were large cuts to funding across the health sector. So the social workers were just simply saying, we don't know who's made the decision that social work should be done in this way. And we don't have access to talking to those people or discussing that with those people. So basically this last thing is what a lot of social workers were saying. We do not feel in charge of saying what social work is, saying what we do, how we do it, and why. It's out of our hands, so hence the disempowerment. And I know this sounds really negative, but I have to say these are the messages that generally come across. It doesn't matter what kind of work setting people are in. Okay, so to me that's from the ground level, these are the kinds of challenges that people are experiencing. Now I want to just go a little bit more academic about this context. This would be my postmodern analysis, if you like, of this context. And I'm really saying the current context has three dimensions to it. Firstly, there's the economic downturn, which I think certainly most of us in the Western world are experiencing. I have to say I haven't talked about this in, where is it? It's Brazil, China and India, isn't it, who are experiencing an upturn. So I don't know what it's like there. But certainly in terms of the Western world where I'm used to interacting, the economic downturn is having a huge effect on professional practice. There is global competition within all of that. So basically we have to get more efficient, more able to justify what we do and able to do it more cheaply in order to compete. And then there are processes of deprofessionalisation that are also happening in relation to that. And I would translate this as a crisis on three levels. And when I say the profession, I actually mean all professions. But obviously we feel it more in social work, I think, because we're, it's not so easy for us to justify a distinctive knowledge base as it might be for other professions. We probably pride ourselves a little bit more on a value base, and that is much harder to justify in the current conditions. So it's a crisis of knowledge, values and power, and I'll just talk about, I would have talked about each of those. Okay, firstly the crisis of knowledge. What I've tried to do is frame this in terms of a problem or a question, if you like, that we need to grapple with. So for me, the crisis of knowledge turns on the question of how do we try to work effectively when the conditions that we're working in are much more uncertain. So, and by that I mean that often outcomes are uncertain. So we can have a certain way of practicing that we even feel has been tried and tested. But actually you can never guarantee what outcomes you're going to get from that, because contexts can change. Okay? The meanings of a situation can differ and often be conflictual because you've got different interest groups involved in every situation that you work with. Okay? So one, you can never control for it, but you can never predict what is going to happen either. Now, I say that's a crisis because we are being asked to practice more effectively, more efficiently, and actually more certainly, when in fact our environments are going in the opposite direction. And how do we actually develop and use knowledge, professional knowledge, in a way that is going to ensure the kinds of outcomes we want? And I would say that a postmodern analysis makes us aware that that is even more difficult to do in the current environment, and becoming even more difficult at every moment, in fact. I trained in social work in the 70s, and I always remember it sounded so simple in the textbooks. You just followed a line, you know. You did your, well, we even used to call it diagnosis, so that will tell you how old I am. We used to use that language. We then moved on, we called it assessment. So you did your assessment, You worked out what your problem was and then you matched the solution to the problem. I think there are probably some of us who are still trying to do that, and certainly in the UK they would say that that's what they try and do. They put in a new policy and they expect a new set of practices each time and they expect that to work. But in fact most practitioners will tell you it doesn't work so easily. And so where do you get the knowledge that is going to allow you to practice in that kind of a way? And of course we all need to do research, but most of us also know that research lags way behind practice. Because it takes, one, you've got to get the funding to do it. Well, first you have to write the grant proposal, it takes longer, then you've got to get the funding. Then you've actually got to employ your team of people to do the research, and then you have to write it up. All of that can take years, even just for one simple project. So research tends to lag behind the actual practice as it's being experienced. So we cannot rely on research to provide all of the knowledge that we need in order to practice effectively in any one situation. So that's why there's a crisis of knowledge. I think I must be accidentally pressing something off when I do that, mustn't I? Okay, crisis of values. So this is about really a question of how we maintain our own integrity, when in fact there are pressures to be more technological, more bureaucratic, and more economically feasible. And many of those movements work against just basic values of care for people and helping people, or treating people as whole human beings. You see, they don't quite fit with being more technological. I think the problem is that many workers now feel that they cannot even ensure the welfare of the people they work with when they do what they're told to do as employees. I don't know, if any of you who are practicing social work at the moment, do you feel this at all? That sometimes if you work in the way that you're told to work, it works against the interests? Yes. I'm very interested, because when I say this in England, the whole room erupts, they all agree. In Canada, not so many. But there's a few of you here who feel that. I remember talking to social workers in Britain who would often say that, in fact, they think that they are doing a disservice to people in the child protection system often, when they, for instance, have to conclude that they must remove the child. Actually, removing the child is not necessarily welfare for anyone in that situation, including the child. So often social workers are actually feeling they're working absolutely against their own value system when doing the job that they're paid to do. So that's the crisis there.
Just
I must be pressing the wrong thing, am I?
Up or down, but not
I'm probably pressing across, I think. Okay. All right, the crisis of power. I think it's generally recognised now that professionals are actually having less control over what they do in their jobs and how that is managed. So the issue is that even if we do have integrity, even if we feel that we do have good knowledge and relevant knowledge, often the power to exercise that in the way we want to is taken away from us. This is a deprofessionalisation that we're experiencing. Now, this is not all bad. Of course, there is a new professionalism which recognises that as professionals we need to be more accountable. And of course we should. And we also need to take more diverse interests into account. But of course when we do that, we are recognising the voices and perspectives of other people who are not necessarily professionals. So in Britain, for instance, the service user movement is very strong. And of course service user perspectives need to be taken into account. But not all service users agree, of course, even amongst themselves, over what should be done. So in fact there has to be a lot more management of whose perspectives prevail within all of that. And professionals' voice is becoming lessened, I feel, in that kind of environment. Do you have interprofessionalism here as an issue? Yeah? Okay, and when I do travel around, I do find that it's mostly social workers who are threatened by interprofessionalism. And it's again because we often feel that we are the least valued profession, so that we're going to lose out even more when we have to compete or even collaborate with other professions. Now that may or may not be true, but I'm just saying what the perception is. And we do, of course, get other professions saying that they think that they can do social work, whereas we don't tend to get social workers saying they can be medical practitioners, for instance, or nurses, but you do get it vice versa. Okay, we won't go there, we know what that means, but the issue is I think that's another pressure on social work practice. Pressure from management. In fact, I'm just being involved in a competency project in Canada at the moment, trying to write competencies from a social work point of view, which includes values, for instance, and theory. And I keep being told that the people who are going to fund the project won't understand that. Apparently they don't understand anything unless it's written purely in behavioural terms. Now, of course, the problem with that is that that's not how we want to speak about our work. So it is constantly feeling like we are not in charge of defining how we do things. And of course, if there is uncertainty, then it does mean less control for us. Go and get this right. Ah, got it. Okay. Oh no, that went back, didn't it? This is a test to see whether you even I almost didn't remember. Okay. All right, so how does critical reflection help then in this kind of environment? So I'm just going to first tell you quickly what it involves, and then as we go through my talk, I'll tell you a little bit more about the theory behind it. But basically, when I do critical reflection with people, I usually run it as a small group process. When I say small group, it's probably anything from about 8 people to about 15. And it does involve different practitioners, each of them bringing a story about their practice, so something very concrete that we can help them reflect on. And then we have a series of questions that we can ask them to help them look at what's underneath, what's the thinking behind or underneath what they're saying about their practice. Rather than looking at what they're saying, we want to see what's implied by that. Okay? And it's often that when they do that, they're able to re-examine what they did and their thinking behind it, and they often want to change it. Because once they've examined it, it may occur to them, well, actually, that thinking was relevant 20 years ago because of my experience then, but in fact, I might have changed a bit since then, or I might have learnt a bit more, so it's not relevant now. I mean, most of you would be aware that you've probably had formative experiences earlier in life, I hope. Okay. And what tends to happen, I think, is that we do learn things from those experiences, whether we make that explicit or not. And it's that learning which we still continue to work on, but we might not be obviously examining it all the time. For instance, one of the things that happens when practitioners tell their stories to me is that they will often tell a story of something that happened in their first year of graduating, or maybe it was in their first placement, and they found that experience so notable that they often had a strong reaction to it, and it's that reaction that they carry throughout their professional career. Rather than constantly learning from new experiences, they base their learning on that one initial experience. So it means that we need to keep re-examining as we go through, because obviously we change as people as we go through life, but we don't always integrate that into our constant learning as professionals. So what happens is that I'm trying to get people to develop new guidelines as a result of that learning. So more on the theory later, but that's basically the process. Nice. You see, I'm a real technology buff. Just first wanted to say what happens to me when I hear all of these stories. I do actually find it very humbling. I think one of the things that has struck me the most is that I am utterly intrigued at how much social workers will put themselves out to help other people. That is, despite where they work, despite the social workers' own backgrounds. There's an awful lot of social workers who are just really decent people, who go beyond the call of duty to try to help others and who actually really do care. Now, I also find this enlightening because most of the theory that you look at about practice doesn't talk about professional practice in that way. It tends to talk about theories or knowledge or research. But that very caring value part of social work is much harder to talk about in a hard-nosed kind of way. So it's sort of missing in the literature. And I just find that very, very humbling to reconnect with that when I hear people's stories of their practice experience. The second thing, many of these things won't be surprising to you, of course, but they are always surprising to me as an academic, I guess, because what I'm doing when I do critical reflection is I'm being forced to engage with practice from the practitioner's point of view. And so I'm simply reminded that practice experience is very complex, but it's also integrated. Now, that might sound a bit banal to you or even obvious, but I'm emphasising this because when you read the literature on experience, and when you read the literature that looks at researching experience, certainly up until recently, it's been more about saying that you have to focus on one aspect because it's all too difficult otherwise. In fact, I have a colleague in management who says that he doesn't even talk about experience because it's too difficult to define. Well, it is too difficult to define, but for me that means it's probably got to be one of the things we do have to struggle with trying to understand better. And people, when they have an experience, they don't separate out their emotions, they don't separate out their theories, they don't separate out their actions. They all come together in the experience. So I'm constantly reminded that it is all integrated and it's complex because there are many different dimensions and we cannot always pinpoint what works in what kind of a way, okay? And often we just don't know what it all means. So it is very difficult, this is the third point, to find a meaningful framework to interpret experience. And generally speaking, that's when I do critical reflection, people bring experiences that they cannot find a meaning for, basically. So they've kind of sat out there. Like I remember one person, this was a very good social work practitioner, I think had about 20 years experience. He brought an incident to talk about, which was the first time we had to remove a child from a family. And to be honest, he started crying in the session that we had. He was still so distressed by it. And I found this very interesting because it was known that he had done a lot of good social work. He was very, very well regarded. But he could not somehow integrate this very traumatic experience that he'd had 20 years ago with his view of himself as a capable and competent practitioner 20 years later. So just finding a meaningful framework for how does my distress fit with all of this? And many professionals feel that they're not supposed to be distressed or traumatised, that somehow being a good professional means that you don't feel those things or that you've got answers somehow that allow you to deal with it. So experience is a very hard thing to pin down and very hard to find meaning for. And often I also find that people do go to theory, formal theory, to find answers, and they often find it lacking. And it may be that they're not applying the theory very well, but it also may be that the theories themselves are inadequate at providing a framework of meaning. So sometimes this also means that people cannot even articulate what their experience is. they sometimes get caught up and they try to tell me a theory rather than their experience. And I'm always reminded that many years ago some Australian person, whose name I've now forgotten, did an interesting study on the theories that social workers use. Can you guess how many theories came up? I know this is going to sound ridiculous and I should remember the reference, but it was 212. And I think that was actually the different labels that people used rather than the theories. But I've also conducted research where people have said, I use blah blah theory. But then when they tell me what they're doing, I'm thinking, I'm not sure how that fits with the theory. And I'm sure people say that about me anyway, but that's by the by. The issue is that often people are lacking in finding a way of talking about their experience that's meaningful to them, and that the theories that exist don't often help. Or they help a little bit, but they're not quite equal to the task, perhaps. Particularly this comes out with emotion. People do not know how to make meaning of their emotion, or even to talk about it in a way that feels okay for a professional person. So there was that man who was distressed at taking the child away. I've also had quite a few social workers talk about the time when they lost their temper with a client, and they just feel so bad about that. I even remember one poor person who I think she took a call in her office, but it was one of those open plan offices where people could hear conversations. And she took a call, and the call was to tell her that one of her clients had just died. So she was upset, she was crying. And someone else in the office said that she shouldn't have been upset, that meant she was unprofessional. And that absolutely stayed with her. I remember another woman, a very interesting woman, dedicated social worker who had a student on placement, and she actually felt this student wasn't going to be a good social worker and didn't have good social work values. Am I making it hard for you to take? Oh, no. Right. I should run, shouldn't I? And she actually swore at the student. And this was a fascinating story, because when she told the story, she didn't tell us that she swore at the student. She just said that she got angry at him. And we did the reflection for half an hour, and at the end of the session she said, but I swore at him, and burst into tears. And so it was the actual swearing which was the issue for her. But so, you know, she didn't even feel she could say that to us initially. But there certainly wasn't a theoretical framework that talks about the need to swear at students. Okay. Now, I don't mean that we should swear at students, but I also do mean it's a realistic part of experience. Particularly if you take your job as a social worker seriously and you feel someone's not going to fit. Okay. But she had no idea what to do with that, and the strong emotion about that. So I also learned the place of fundamental values, because I think in that story it was actually saying what her strong values about social work was. Okay? But again, it's almost like there was nowhere for that to sit. And she felt it wasn't okay to have those strong values about social work, because it was all overshadowed by the fact that she had sworn at the student, and she felt she was unprofessional as a result. So it's showing for me, I think, this next bit, which is a need to be a way of professionals finding a place for their own integrity. In other words, finding a way that they can act upon their own values, okay, despite whatever the circumstances are, and how they can integrate that in a way that fits both in the workplace but fits for themselves. Okay. Now, I would say that this does sometimes happen in the critical reflection process, because what people become aware of is what their own strong values are, and then they can make a decision about whether they accept those or not. And then once they're clearer about that, they can then find ways to work. Okay. And in that woman's case, the one who swore at her student, in fact, she was able to develop a theory of practice which talked about being a passionate professional. So it wasn't saying it's okay to swear, but it was saying it's okay to feel strongly about your profession. Okay? And so how then do you integrate those strong feelings in a way that's going to be constructive? Okay? And of course, that kind of experience can be very empowering. Because in fact, I think what is happening is that people are being able to value their own experience and their own perspective, but find a way to act on it as well. Will I get the right button? Up.
Okay.
Okay, good. I had to read it to make sure we hadn't done that already. Okay. So, these are some of the things it does, which is kind of a repeat of what I just said. So those were my last observations, but this is how I think critical reflection does help. It does help give people a meaningful framework. It does find a way for integrating emotion, because if we're talking about experience as a holistic kind of thing, then emotion fits within that. It does direct the blame away from personal characteristics. So the social worker who swore at her student, she no longer saw herself as unprofessional. She saw herself as a passionate professional. Okay? So it wasn't framed in terms of her being lacking, but it was framed more in terms of what she was and what she had to offer. It does provide a contextual framework, and in that social worker's case, actually, we looked at, well, what were the circumstances that led her to swear? Rather than just simply saying swearing was a bad thing, we actually looked more broadly at what was involved in all of that as a whole experience. And it did then give her a broader framework. It reaffirmed fundamental values, in her case particularly, reminding her of what was important, and to her, social work was important. And it found a new way for her to enact fundamental values. In fact, what she said at the end of that session is that now that she could accept that it was okay to be a passionate professional, she was less likely to swear, because the swearing was really an outcome of feeling really frustrated. But actually she would feel less frustrated if she felt it was okay to be passionate. She would find other ways to be passionate about her work. Okay? So it does feel like individuals can be more in charge of making their own identities as social workers, and yes, it is empowering. In fact, empowering is the word a lot of them use. That was it. Okay, all right, a bit more detail on critical reflection. Is this all going okay so far? You sort of think you're getting what I'm saying? Yeah? Okay, good. A little more detail on critical reflection then. There are many ways of theorising critical reflection, I should say. I have chosen the learning from experience approach, which really, everybody's heard of John Dewey, the famous educationalist. Okay, it was probably his writing back in the, when did he write? I think the translations, the later editions were in the 1930s, but I think he was probably writing in the 1910s, so it's from a fair while ago. But his work is still relevant. And he would really just say that reflection is triggered by an experience that people don't understand. He called it a discrepant experience. So it's an experience that somehow stands outside our normal experience. We don't know what to make of it. It doesn't fit with prior experience. It maybe doesn't fit with our idea of ourselves. And so we are caused to reflect on that. Okay? And then presumably when we learn from it. Now we'll do this in more detail at the workshop on Saturday, but basically I would say that means that what we're trying to do is develop some kind of framework of learning from that experience that sits outside that will turn into broader guidelines for, well, living actually, because because Dewey's talking about life, he's not just talking about professional practice. But if we're developing broader guidelines for living, we can also develop guidelines for professional practice within that. Now, does anybody here think that they don't learn from experience? You don't have to divulge personal secrets now. But most of us assume that we do that. We do that automatically. In fact, what I find is that yes, we do, but we're not always aware what we learn. And sometimes we don't learn things that are so great. Like, has anyone here experienced a bad relationship? Okay. Now, you don't have to tell me what it was, but do everyone think that they learned good things from that? Yeah? So what would be an example of good learning from having a bad relationship?
Well, maybe avoid it in the future.
Yeah. Okay, and avoid what?
What was wrong? What went wrong?
What we perceive wrong,
Looking for?
what we perceive as wrong,
Yes.
maybe we didn't know before.
Okay.
Now we know what is it.
So we're drawing up some principles about what might be wrong about a relationship, or maybe the signs of what could go wrong. Okay, yeah. Now that would be good learning because it's been turned into something bigger. So I have to say, I asked this recently and someone said that they learned not to go out with blue-eyed Sagittarians. So we were divided about whether that was good learning or not. Okay. So it depends on the content that is in the principle as well. Because so sometimes people develop principles that are more restrictive. Does anyone know someone who's had a bad relationship and decided they'll never have another?
I have one experience where a social worker who was supposed to be a professional but didn't have experience to me because he doesn't have any child and he deals with people who have children, and he was forced to take the child away from the parent, and the parent asked him, "Do you have a child?" And he said, "No." So the question was, so how do you relate what is going on to your experience? And for me, it was more or less like she has learned it. She knows what she's doing, but she doesn't really go into detail as to what kind of relationship that exists between the parent and the child. Yes. So when that, I don't know if you are supposed to call that one experience, because she doesn't really live that practical life. So at the end of the day, the parent question, but of course it had to go back to the government for the government to react.
And did it have the substance to answer? Yeah. And I think you're talking about experience as in having had life experiences there. And sometimes if you haven't had the life experience, you cannot articulate the detail that needs to go into that. You're quite right. And I think sometimes when we do have experiences, and many of us have had a lot of experience, and in fact I don't think the amount is an issue, it's what you learn from it, isn't it? But sometimes people have experiences and they actually learn negative things in the sense that it closes them down more. So if someone has a bad relationship and they decide they'll never have another one, actually that's restrictive learning, it's not good learning. Okay? Now my point here is that often we need to learn how to learn from experience. Okay? Because just because we have an experience doesn't mean that we learn good things. Okay, so critical reflection is partly about learning how to learn from experience in a good kind of a way. And that, Dominic, that example you used, that social worker could have been okay. Even if they hadn't had a child, they could have generalised their experience from knowing people who'd had children and trying to understand that experience. So they could have then had some substance, you see. So it's actually about learning how to learn from the experience we do have. Okay? And it doesn't come naturally at all. So this is one reason that I do in-depth training with critical reflection. Of course, the second question is, how do you do it? Because in fact, most of us don't know how we learn from experience. We know that we draw conclusions about what happens to us, but do we go through a rigorous process? Well, probably not. Because usually what we conclude may be based on all sorts of preconceptions or prior experience or whatever. So I simply use Donald Schoen's initial process, which is just looking for the assumptions that are underneath that experience for us. Now what I find is once you start doing that, people actually get to a point where they're able to articulate what are the most fundamental ideas that are operating there, whether or not they were aware of them in the first place. Okay? And this is partly what makes it critical reflection. It's getting to a very fundamental level, is the first thing. The second thing about being critical is, of course, the critical social science view, which is that it's about understanding how power works, particularly at the individual level and its relation to the social context. Okay. I can see I've run off the slide there, isn't it? This definition was just trying to put it all together. So it's a process of re-examining the fundamentals of experience and using this to learn from it, to make new meaning and new guidelines for practice. And it can be framed in many different ways with many different theories. And I have to say, I was admitting to Pavel last night that in fact, I started out just practicing with critical reflection, not theorising. I didn't read anything. Terrible. I only started reading about it after I'd been doing it for a while, and then became very confused because there is so much literature on reflection and critical reflection. It comes from many different perspectives, many different theories. The literature does not tend to refer to other theories in and of itself, so very difficult to work out how it fits together. And so what I'm presenting to you here is very much an integrated view of many of the different perspectives. And we might touch on them later if we have time. But you also see I'm saying at the end there that it needs to be conducted in an appropriate learning environment as well. Because what I find is that thinking in a critically reflective way is not the norm. It is not normative. Most of us live and work in situations that are much more positivist in terms of our assumptions about knowledge and theory, etc. So being critically reflective also requires us to understand the culture of being critically reflective and setting up environments to do that well. How am I going? We've got to have some time for questions, haven't we? So I'm just going to... Russ, is this all being meaningful so far? Mm-hmm. Okay. I'll go a little bit faster. Okay, these are some of these critical frameworks, which I know that you know something about, because Pavel has been telling me that you certainly have done some material on reflexivity you use. Okay, I've picked out what I think are probably the 5 main types of theories that are involved. And the reflective practice is Donald Schoen's work, which some of you are familiar with. Basically pointing out there is a big gap between theory and practice, which we all know. And of course what Schoen said is that if you can become aware of the theory that is implicit in our practice, it is a way of improving it. So that's what reflective practice is. It's being able to improve your practice because you're aware of the implicit theory. The reflexivity is actually being aware of how you as your own social self influence situations and the knowledge that you bring. Okay, so it's really saying that we reflexively construct our situations. So what we see and what we interpret is a reflection of who we are personally and socially. Because the linguistic turn is the postmodern deconstructive perspective. So it's particularly being aware of how the language we use has powerful functions. So, you know, what's the discourse I'm subscribing to? And whose discourse is that? And what does that actually say about who I think I am in relation to other people? Okay. Critical theories, of course, you're familiar with these. And I particularly like the fact that in critical social theory, we do get to understand how individuals are socially constructed and vice versa. How we as individuals also participate in creating our social environments. That bit is always hard to get, I find, for social workers. But I've been very pleased to see that in the papers I've read, there's a clear understanding of that there, which is great. But I think it's important to see how the two interact, and that's what critical theory gives us. Spirituality, these are much more recent now, but there's a lot of literature which is talking about how critical reflection helps you understand what's fundamentally important, you know, return to basic values, a return to basic beliefs about how the world works and whether or not there are more universal kinds of values to subscribe to. And a lot of people are using Eastern philosophies, for instance, to help illuminate what critical reflection is. Okay, so they're the main theories. I don't think I'm going to do those in detail. Okay, the process. And again, we'll do more on this on Saturday, but it starts by people bringing a specific experience that somehow sits out there, that they've got some issue with, or they don't understand, or they just can't forget it, or whatever. And we use that as the raw material for reflection. The reflection happens in 2 stages. So the first stage is simply getting out what the hidden fundamental assumptions are and just looking at them. No judgments on them, but just getting them out and looking at them. The second stage is saying, okay, what does this mean now for how I want to think and for how I want to act? So how's it going to change my practice? And then in that stage as well, I actually get people to come up with their own label for their theory of practice. So it's a process of helping them get the theory from their own practice, but start to value it by labelling it. So remember our social worker who swore at the student? So her theory of practice was being a passionate professional. That's the label that she put on it later. Okay. Well, I'm saying you can be used in a number of ways. I usually do small groups, but I do know people who just use it for self-reflection, or they might use it in supervision, so it's just them and their supervisor, or vice versa. And the ethical learning climate is really important. It's drawing up a safe environment so that people feel safe to challenge their thinking. Okay, so it's not safe in order to just reaffirm what they're thinking, because that would be counter to critical reflection. But it's safe in order to help them challenge. All right. And this is what, that's in a summary what the safe learning environment is. And I call it critical acceptance. So the acceptance is a safe bit, critical is a challenge bit. Okay, so basic democratic principles. We want to establish trust, we want to establish respect for each other's stories, confidentiality, etc. It is about not imposing preconceived judgments. Because what I find is as soon as people feel they have to make a judgment or assessment of their story, it closes down reflection. So what we're trying to do is be open to new and different perspectives. And I usually find that if people feel it's okay just to look at different perspectives rather than make judgments on them, then they're able to be more open, particularly to hearing perspectives that might be very different from their own. And I particularly stress, and this is also postmodern, that in fact I want them to be able to hear conflicting perspectives. They don't have to choose one or the other. And it's okay to hear all of them. Okay? This is often one of the things that is most difficult for everyone to do, because most of us, particularly social workers, I think, like to think that we know the right way to think and the right way to do things, and that our job is simply to get people to conform to that. So we do find it very hard, I think, to sit back and to listen to a story and to be open to hearing interpretations which may be entirely different from our own. That is actually extraordinarily hard to do. It's kind of a very advanced form of empathy. But elsewhere, I have talked about this as a kind of a research process, where I actually say we are all co-investigators. But what we are trying to do is to create the most open environment to allow the most possibilities to hearing something which may be entirely different from anything we've known before. So I call it like creative not knowing. So it's almost developing a stance of not knowing so that it's possible to create a different way of knowing. Now, of course, that might not always be necessary, because you may find when you hear a story that actually does fit preconceived categories. But it's best to only decide that once the story's been fully heard and understood. And what I often find in critical reflection is that people, any of the preconceived notions or theories they've already got actually don't fit. That's why they bring the experience. So they do need to create a new label or a new theory to help them with that. So our social worker who swore at the student, once she had the term passionate professional, she was okay. That label seemed to work for her and her experience. But she hadn't had that idea before. Her preconceived notions were that you're either very cool and calm and objective, and that was professional, or you were out of control and that was unprofessional. Very opposite binaries, almost. So it was only when she created a different kind of category that she could actually sit with that experience. Okay, so it's actually staying open in order to find out new ways of being, which is the key here. All right, I'm rushing on. I don't think there's too much more. Oh, okay. I'm not going to do too many more of these. I haven't even got, these are all different ones. I'm going to just choose one of these, I think. I'm going to talk about Kevin and the letter. Okay, this was, Kevin was someone who did critical reflection with me many years ago. He was a team leader in a non-government organisation. I think it was a child and family service. But he brought this incident where he basically felt there was corruption in the organisation at the highest level. But he brought this issue to us because he felt that he couldn't do anything about it, but wanted to do something about it, but felt that he couldn't. He felt that his position was far too junior, and he felt that he was far too vulnerable to do something. But anyway, we critically reflected on that situation with him. And to our absolute surprise, for all of, when I say our, the whole class, when he came back after having reflected on that, he told us that in fact he wrote a letter to management complaining about the alleged corruption. And we all kind of gasped because we thought that was a fairly risky thing to do. And what happened as a result is the management committee actually took action. He wasn't promoted, but he wasn't fired either. Okay. Interestingly, what he then decided to do was leave social work. He felt that he was always interested in union work and politics. And I guess he felt that he became empowered from taking that action. So he left social work and became a union leader. I found that very interesting because I was completely shocked at the decision that he'd taken, even though clearly the reflection, I mean, it might motivate something like that. But I think what it did in his case is it got him in touch with what was fundamentally important to him. And so he then acted on that basis. So you can see that we often don't know what the outcome, I certainly don't know what the outcome is going to be, and the people who do it don't know what the outcome is going to be either. But it's very, very interesting that what it does is it triggers a process where people start to get in touch with what's fundamentally important, and they then decide often to make decisions on that basis, whereas they've been caught or stuck before that. So I don't expect that the outcomes will always be quite that dramatic or drastic for everybody, but some people have spoken about the changes as being life-changing in the sense that it does get them in touch with who they want to be, which is very easy to lose sight of, I think, when you're working in an environment where you're just trying to do the right thing at this particular time in order to keep your job or whatever. So it is about kind of taking people out and pulling them back and getting them to regroup, I guess, if you like. I think we've talked about some of this already. It does unblock where people feel stuck. They do get empowered, and these are the different ways they get empowered. It is about more agency. It's about actually them feeling that they can exercise a bit more influence than they might have before. It is about helping them find ways to act. It is about helping them remake their identities. It does enable more integrity, and overall it's seen as more empowering. A place for differences. This is also very useful, I think. People do report feeling that they don't have to see people with conflicting perspectives as people who are totally different. Particularly the case I've found often with social workers who talk about working with the police, as you have to do in child protection, often finding ways of being able to work in a more collegiate way with people who have very opposing perspectives. And part of it is actually being able to hear and understand and listen to different perspectives in a way that gets to what might be a common basis in all of that. Okay, so social workers, for instance, may recognise that police also do care about the welfare of children. They may have very different methods, but they also do care. Right, so if we all do care, can we find other ways of working together that might sit better for both of us? Okay. All right, I think I'm going to just try to find the one that... This is going to be the last one I want to talk about, but just saying how it addresses some of the aspects now of the postmodern challenges. So despite uncertainty, I think what critical reflection does do is actually clarify frameworks, but also assists people to tolerate ambiguity and even tolerate conflict, if you like. Because they're no longer searching for one right answer. What they are searching for is, what does it mean? What does it mean for this person? How do we get that to sit together and find a way together for working? It does answer demands for effectiveness in some ways, because if you're coming to the chase, as you do with critical reflection, it does allow you to be more effective, because you're actually getting very quickly to what needs to be prioritised. It does give more options for working. And there is more accountability, because when you critically reflect, you're also able to articulate and justify your rationale behind that. And the last one, can I work out what that says? I think it probably just says that it is finding a place for integrity and creating new meaning there. So I think it does do something to address those challenges of post-modernity, if you like. It's not necessarily about making structural changes, but I would actually say that in making structural changes there is always a personal element still. And what critical reflection does is it addresses its starting point on the personal level. And I do tend to find, like Kevin and his letter, okay, that was started as a personal experience of his in feeling that he couldn't challenge the management. But in fact, something freed him up to do that in doing the critical reflection process, and he was able to make quite a significant change in his organisation as a result. Okay, I'm going to leave it there because you will want a little time maybe to ask some questions or make some comments or anything really.
Okay, I'm a bit curious. How do you concretely work with language and discourses? What technique do you use? Or what techniques?
In doing the critical
Reflection of
yes.
language and discursive practice and these things.
Yeah, what I do is I develop some questions based on postmodernism, post-structuralism, deconstruction actually, based on reflexivity, etc. Very simple questions like, what's missing here? So in your story, what might be left out? I think I was telling Pavel last night, another thing that I do is sometimes I ask a group to think about what might be all the different ways of interpreting that situation. So you see that's multiple perspectives I'm asking for there. And what I do is I ask people just to play a game. What might they all be? And then I often find that if I ask that, people are enabled to think freely about other perspectives without having to justify their own. And if you take away that need to justify their own, it opens them up. Another one I might say is, well, what words are you using? I wonder what that means. Okay? Or how do you see power in your situation? Where is your own power? Okay, so you can see these questions are based on particularly theoretical frameworks, but I don't call them that. I think if I call them that, it turns people off. So what I tend to do is I try to work with the experience first and then put the label on later.
Thank you.
Yeah, that sort of answers what you were asking? Okay. Now there may be some skeptics in the audience too, feel free, because...
Not so skeptical, but maybe I have one question. Your reflection starts from an individual level, and it is done on an individual level or small group level. But have you said on the start the problems like deprofessionalization and so on, they are rather of a structural nature? How to overcome this gap between individual and structural problems?
Okay, I mean, and my answer would be in critical theory itself. Because in critical theory we understand that there is always a link between the individual and the social structure at the level of which the individual holds social beliefs. So what critical reflection is trying to do is expose the social beliefs. So what do I believe about my own power in the organisation? Okay? What do I believe about my ability to influence the organisation? What is my belief about my role, and how does this frame what I do or not? So you see, these are actually social questions, but they're actually looking at it at the point at which the individual holds them. And now what I find is that people need that, because otherwise they don't know how to act. And I think in Kevin's case, he wouldn't have written the letter unless he'd actually looked at what beliefs he held, which were stopping him from writing the letter. So I always say it's not a substitute for making structural changes, but it's a starting point. The problem is if you believe that all the changes are out there, or that they are other people's fault, it's much harder to act on them. Whereas if you can see where your own beliefs intersect with that, you can at least start on those. And actually it's surprisingly empowering, I have to say. In fact, I was telling Pavel last night, I did a reflection in one of the groups, and my story was actually complaining about my university, my department, complaining about a course I had to teach, and of course my hidden discourse was that I was powerless. But of course the reflection revealed to me that I was making choices about staying like that, in fact, and it motivated me, in fact, to make a whole lot of changes, which I then did. But I had nowhere to hide. And so I think it's very powerful even in that simple kind of a way. I mean, we all construct defences. I hate to use the psychodynamic language, but sometimes it's meaningful. We all construct defences or ways of thinking that are safe for us. Okay? And I sometimes think that we construct the social structure as being out there. And that's safe then, because it's not our responsibility to do something about it. But once we take responsibility for it also being in here, then we are responsible for making those changes here at least. And then it does actually motivate other changes. Does that sort of answer what you're asking?
So
or, yeah.
It means that you are talking about empowerment to take an action in a direction which is maybe a different than until now, to make something, to take a responsibility or things like that, yeah.
Yes, that's part of it, yeah.
Yeah.
But the empowerment all starts with the change thinking, actually, yeah. Yeah, Magda, yeah.
And maybe I would like to continue with this and also ask, because you have many experiences in doing the critical thinking, and I really like your idea that the change, the social change, somehow has to start from the individual taking the responsibility. So maybe I would like to ask if you have these experiences when these individual decisions are changes, how if they really develop to some structural changes.
Yes and no. I don't deliberately follow people to see what happened. But that's why I did put the experience of Kevin in, because that is one case where, yeah, it did happen. And we weren't even deliberately looking for that. I don't know, people report back to me that they have made a lot of changes, but I don't know what they are, to be honest. Some people do report that they've been able to make changes within their organisation. So for instance, they report setting up opportunities for critical reflection, and then they report being able to make suggestions to management for changes on the basis of that too. But I don't know specifically what they are. I do it and then leave. That's a very luxurious position. It'd be nice to do some research on that, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes my wife practices critical reflection skills on me. And then it's a real challenge because it's very difficult to respond to that and to be the subject of this kind of approach. And that leads me to the question, in your experience, how broad can you apply this method among social workers? Or do you see that some kind of types of social workers, or perhaps types of persons, the method works better than with others?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I really would like to know more answers to this one. I usually say it should be voluntary if you're going to participate, because it doesn't work for everyone. It's a particular learning culture, and it doesn't work for all cultures. I mean, I think some people claim that it's harder for men to participate in this, and I have to say most of the groups that I run are mostly women, because I guess women are dominant anyway socially.
Any critical reflection?
Probably in critical reflection. I remember once I had a very strong male manager who I highly respected. He became very interested in critical reflection, and he said he was going to come and join one of our groups, and we all got really frightened. And he never did. And I think that was about us believing that he came from a very different culture, and we couldn't see him fitting with this kind of culture. I think if you are very task-focused, if you are used to finding answers, this can be quite difficult. And it is more difficult for groups of managers that I have run this for, because it's just kind of working out what the problem is and then putting a solution on it. And this is not about finding a solution. So it's hard for some people to sit with that.
That's what my wife keeps telling me, you don't need to find a solution. They will be happy anyway, so.
And in fact, what some people say is they find more solutions than they bargained on, but that's not actually what they're going into it for. Yeah, so it doesn't sit with everyone. And some people drop out of the groups too.
Interesting, you mentioned a cultural difference perhaps. Can you say a bit more about it?
Well, I think like some of my Hong Kong colleagues would say it doesn't work for Chinese men. I don't want to go into stereotypes too much. But I think if you know, much more rationalist or perhaps task focused, then it's harder to do this kind of work. I always work very hard at setting up the learning culture, and I'm explicit about what that is, so people know what they're signing up to beforehand. There's a lot of vulnerability, and not everyone's comfortable with that either. And you might argue that they have a right not to be comfortable if they work in an organisation that's very blaming, for instance. So if they want to do critical reflection in that environment, I say that they must be explicit about the culture that's being set up, where the information goes, what is done with it, etc. And sometimes people decide they won't do critical reflection in their organisation, but they will choose a critical friend from outside, someone they trust, and do it with them. Yes? Oh, sorry.
I would like to ask if you have some experience with some other professional groups, and especially, for example, if you think it's useful for social policy makers as well, and if you have some experience.
Especially. Social policy makers need it the most. Yes, I do. I have done this with medical practitioners, with nurses, sometimes in a mixed group, teachers, some policy makers, managers. I would say it's not a social work method. It's actually an educational method. Social workers were not the first to develop it, and not the best at developing it either. Most of the literature that I've quoted to you is educational literature, and that is usually applied across all the professions in professional learning. And in fact, most professions now have a reflective tradition. I guess I've mostly done it with social workers because that's where I'm known. I think probably my approach works better with social workers because that's my culture. But I have been totally intrigued and fascinated by the fact that sometimes non-social workers will attend my training and find it very, very helpful in some ways because it's a very new approach for them too. So it can be adapted. I think that's what I like about it. It's very easily adaptable for whoever the group is, because if you're asking them to bring their own experience, then it's whatever their experience is that they work on. And it can be experienced from their personal life. It doesn't have to be their professional work.
I only point out one question, but I think from my perspective as a sociologist, it's very important to do some critical reflection of myself as a scientist or researcher, and especially in the qualitative research. It seems to me be like a part of dissertation or part of the research to do such a critical reflection of my position in the research and of the context of the research.
Absolutely, yeah.
So probably it's important for all of us.
Yeah. See, because I would consider a sociologist a professional. You see, in the sense that we are all professionals if we're applying some kind of learning to actions. So what critical reflection helps with is that, actually. But then when you think about it, we're all professionals in our own lives as well, aren't we? Because it is about having some kind of meaningful framework or theory that we're using to apply to our actions in life. Okay, now I don't mean to blur the distinctions between person and professional, but I do mean to say that this is actually about how you translate theory into practice and how you develop guidelines for how you live and how you practice. So that actually applies to all of us in a way. So in fact all of us can reflect on any aspect of our living or any aspect of our work. So it's not profession exclusive, so to speak. I think that, does that probably answer your question a little better too? Yeah? Okay. Sorry, yeah.
At the beginning you talked about the professionalization. So maybe it's my neglect, but I was not completely sure what you mean with this notion, if you could more explicitly refer to the key aspects of this concept.
The deprofessionalisation?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, really that is just referring to the fact that professional power is being eroded. Yeah. So, I mean, do you have the term managerialism here?
Yes,
yeah.
of course.
Yeah. See, it's interesting, we had it in Australia, but not in the UK.
We do have rather political managerialism.
Okay. I mean,
what do you mean in your context?
Well,
that's similar.
Yeah.
That's very similar.
Where basically management power is increasing and professional power is decreasing, basically. Yeah. And it's content-free management as well, so it's management that doesn't necessarily come from your own professional base and doesn't recognise or understand professionals' work. So yeah. Does that answer it? Do you want me to say
yes,
more?
Yes. I was not sure.
Yeah.
So you have answered many of my questions, so I am a little bit shy to ask more, but still. So you stress the role of ethical climate during this process of critical reflection, but I don't understand what you mean exactly. So could we describe it more?
Yes, and I'll just go back to that slide too if I can find it, because I probably cut this down a bit from. Yeah, this is the safe learning climate, really. So what I'm saying here is I'm trying to think about what is the learning culture that I'm trying to set up here, which might be different from the broader environment that people are learning or working in. So for example, I would say that, you know, in most social work environments, they're used to having supervision that is really making some judgments about whether their practice is adequate or whether they've done the right thing with a case, or it might be analysing a case. Okay. So what I'm saying in this environment, it's non-judgmental. We're actually not trying to pass judgment on the person or their behaviour. What we are trying to do, though, is to open up the possibilities for them to learn how to do that for themselves. Okay. Now, that is quite difficult. I think we were saying this at dinner last night, weren't we? The difficulty is that all of us work in a judgmental climate. And that's what a professional is. It basically is trying to make an assessment about what's wrong and then provide some solution or answers. So actually we're trying to work not against that culture, but in a different culture. I think if the principle that's helpful for me when I say it is that to remember we're trying to help someone learn how to learn. And that's the difference. It's not learn what to do or learn how to practice better. We're trying to get them to learn how to learn to do that for themselves. Okay, because we're saying that we don't know what the answers are. This is the postmodern bit very much. We don't know what the answers are because all situations may be different. But what we want to do is ensure that a person learns how to learn from that situation so that they are their own best modifier, their own best supervisor, their own best assessor, if you like. Now, I'm not saying that they shouldn't have other kinds of assessment anyway, where they will have. But just for the purposes of critical reflection, it's getting them to learn how to learn to do that for themselves. So what we're trying to do in the ethical learning environment is set that up. We're trying to set up the climate to help them do that rather than do it for them. Is that making some more sense? This is kind of the general principles, yeah. So it is, so I do say to everyone in the group, it's not about imposing your view on them. It's about helping them be open to finding other views. Now that's kind of tricky because usually the best way we tell people what they should think is to tell them what to think. Okay. Well, we think that's the best way, it's the most direct. But what we're trying to do is to facilitate them to think about that. So that's why we ask questions. We might say, well, I wonder what words you were using there. And what does that say about how you see yourself? Okay, not saying, I think you see yourself as a victim. Or that I might say, oh, it's interesting when you say that, because this is what I think about. I wonder what you think about when you say that. What are you thinking? So you see, you're putting the focus on the person for them to think through. So the ethics of it is quite different. I think it is about saying, we don't know what the answers are, but we want to create an environment where you do. So it's how you communicate that too. Yeah. But we'll go into this more on Saturday,
yes,
if you like. Yeah.
I'm looking forward.
It's quite a bit of detail in this one, because this is kind of the hardest bit for people to understand, I think.
It's very difficult to imagine how to set the climate, for example, in any kind of biographical organization. Is it possible for such a group of people?
Yeah, I'd love to get you to talk to some of the people in London, because they're doing this across the west of London now in children's and adult services.
Yes.
What they're doing is training people in the model, and then they set up small groups for people to be in, and they do it regularly. Yeah, and so they set it up according to these ethical principles. Yeah, I'm sure there will be some people in the groups who think it's not working, and then there are others who do. So, yeah, we need more research on that one too. Yeah.
I have a question that's similar to what he asked. How do you do this with policymakers who don't have the power to influence policies, like politicians? Because I have a survey and I ask simple questions about corruption. People have an idea that there's corruption.
Mm-hmm.
They know why there's corruption, but they can't tell you how to deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
So where do you start from and how do you go about it? Sometimes it's quite difficult to get the sentiment from the people themselves. So if you use critical reflection, how do you really decipher?
Well, for instance, if you're saying, like, you're a policy maker that's been asked to do some research on some aspect that will help people make policy, then it would be useful to get a group of policy makers together to look at a piece of practice like that. So if someone asks you to do some research, but you don't necessarily agree with how the research is framed, it would be very interesting to critically reflect on what that was about for you. And wonder what power you do have as well. That is one of the questions I would ask in critical reflection. You know, because there's been a lot of material now, a lot of research done on looking at the discretion that people have even in public organisations or bureaucracies. Because many of us construct a bureaucracy as being all-powerful and us as being not. But in fact, when you look at a lot of the research, you see that people roll out policy in many different ways. It's the same policy, but they interpret and act on it differently. So we'd be looking at what is the room for discretion, perhaps in your job. It's very interesting. I presented this recently somewhere in Canada, and somebody said, well, what do you do when you work in an organisation where you have absolutely no power? So I said, well, do they tell you what to wear? Oh, not yet. But anyway, she said, when she left, some of the others said, look, everybody knows that you do what you like in private, and you only ask, you don't ask questions about what you do before you want to do it, you just do it, and then it's a lot easier to apologise later than it is not to do what you want to do in the first place. And I think what they were saying is that every experienced practitioner knows there are ways of working with the system or not. So if someone comes to me with an absolute and says I have no power, what I would get them to do is critically reflect on what that actually means in a particular situation. It's always a sign to me if they make an absolute statement, then that needs some reflection on it. Because actually most of us know there are no absolutes. And many of us still manage to work in situations that seem absolutely unviable. We still manage to do some good in them nonetheless. So it's finding the spaces, I guess, if you want to talk in a postmodern way about it, it's finding the spaces between the binaries. I know we're probably out of time, aren't we, Thomas?
Okay.
Anyway, I'm around.
Maybe we
so
just have
asking
time
more.
for one question. If any, okay, and this will be last question.
So can I ask you if you have any
feedback. How does this type of learning influence the way how professionals think about their clients?
Yeah, in fact, I've probably got quite a few other slides here that talk about the outcomes. What I'll do is I'll send these to Blanca. You can circulate them.
Yeah.
Yeah. But actually, yeah, I have done some research. It looks at certainly what are the outcomes in thinking of people, and many of them do report very different attitudes towards their clients, and finding a lot more options of ways of practicing. So I guess it's a questioning the absolutes again. And once you question the absolutes, you find lots of in-between ways of doing things. So whether or not it's been good outcomes for clients, I don't know. But what I do know is certainly they've found other ways of working that might mean they're going to be more effective. Yeah. My research is not focused on that bit. Interestingly enough, there's hardly any research on critical reflection which looks at longer term outcomes, and that's one of the things I'm trying to do now. That's what I want to work on now, in fact. So we need to know, and we don't know enough. Yeah.
Good. I have to guard the schedule, so
absolutely.
Then I wish to thank you for the lecture.